жінкою не возиться, мені жінкою не возиться, а тютюнка люлька козаку в дорозі знадобиться.
Ой, у лузі червона калина похилилася, чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. Не хилися, червона калино, маєш білий цвіт. Не журися, славна Україно, маєш вільний рід. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо.
Гей, у полі ярої пшениці золотистий лан, розпочали стрільці українські з ворогами там. А ми тую ярою пшеницю і зберемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. А ми тую ярою пшеницю і зберемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. Як повіє буйнесенький вітер широких степів, та й прославить по всій Україні січових стрільців. А ми тую стрілецьку славу збережемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. А ми тую стрілецьку славу збережемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. А ми тую стрілецьку славу збережемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Прийшли окупанти до нас в Україну. Форма новенька, воєнні машини та трохи поплавився їх інвентар. Байрактар. Байрактар. Російські танкісти сховались в кущі, щоб лафтем посьорбати довбані щі, та трохи у щах перегрівся навар. Байрактар. Байрактар. Приперли зі сходу до нас барани для восстановлення
великой страны.
Найкращий пастух баранячих отар. Байрактар. Байрактар. Їх доводи всяке озброєння різне, потужні ракети, машини залізні. У нас на всі доводи є коментар. Байрактар. Байрактар. Вони захопити хотіли нас зразу, а ми зачаїли на орків образу з російських бандитів. Робить примар. Байрактар. Байрактар. Російська поліція справи заводить, та вбивцю рашистів ніяк не знаходить. Хто винен, що в нашому полі глухар? Байрактар. Байрактар. Веде пропаганду кремлівський урод, слова пропаганди ковтає народ. Тепер нове слово знає цар.
Байрактар.
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 Hello everyone, I'm the Enforcer, and welcome back to the Day 92 stream. I'm accompanied by Enforcer Matt.
Good afternoon, everybody.
And today we're going to be reporting what has been going on in Ukraine. Over the past 24 hours, there have been some major developments on the front line here in the Severodonetsk area that have seemed somewhat concerning and are showing that the balance of power, at least within the Severodonetsk region, may have shifted into Russia's favor for a short while. We will, of course, be covering that later on in the news tonight once we reach this area. And so, without further ado, let's go over tonight's schedule for the news. Starting off, we'll be covering two bits of information that we've gotten from the Bucha Hospital European area. There's been a little bit of developments really internationally today that have occurred within this area, and so we'll make sure to cover those first. We actually have no news internationally today. Everything is inside of Ukraine, and so there will be no international news. This will lead us directly into a little bit of news that has occurred near the Sumy city area, and we'll also be moving down and covering our location unknowns, which we have about 11 of, which actually isn't too high of a number, which I'm very happy with. I always try and make sure that our location unknown segment is as small as I can possibly make it, and I try and figure out a general idea of where most stuff happens location-wise. Once we cover the location unknowns, we'll then be moving into the Kharkiv area, which we actually have some news for today. But before we do, we'll actually answer 3 questions from the chat. And then once we answer those 3 questions, we'll move into the Kharkiv area and also cover the news here in the northern Donbass, which there is a load of. And also, of course, the developments that I was speaking about earlier. So if you would like to see the developments that are occurring and the news that we've gotten from the area, stick around because that will be covered later on in the stream. After we cover 3 questions moving from the northern Donbass into the rest of the news from the southern front, we'll once again answer 3 questions from the chat, and then we'll move down to the southern front, cover the news here. We'll also cover the news right near Mykolaiv, and then finally we'll wrap out tonight's stream with another speech from President Zelensky, and then that will be the end of tonight's news, and then we'll enter a question segment for the rest of the stream. Something that was interesting to me and kind of passed through my head right before I started the stream is that I've been doing this ever since day one. Literally since the first few hours. You can go all the way back through my channel's history and actually see the stream I ran within the first hour of missiles landing within Ukraine. And what's very odd to me, and crazy, honestly, is that time has flown, and every single day I add a little number up here to this title. Yesterday it was day 91, I backspaced the 1, and then put in a 2. And I've been doing that for 92 days, just adding one number. And each day that passes, the Ukrainians have held an entire front line against what was supposed to be a world superpower for another 24 hours. And when you think about that, it's honestly very impressive that the Ukrainians have managed to hold their territory for this long. Over 3 months now. We're now entering the 4th month as of today. And so, honestly, insane for me to think about. And so, without further ado, we're now going to get straight into the news. Starting off in the Hostomel area, we can actually see that the Ukrainians are recycling the Miria Antonov 225. Miria means dream in Ukrainian, and the Ukrainians have not given up on this dream of a plane, as they are now going to attempt to recycle it and use the second airframe that is within Ukraine to try and rebuild the Miria into a form that is nearly identical to this one. Here we can see a BTR-60, it appears, dragging away the front part of the fuselage out of the hangar. The whole entire front fuselage got pulled away somewhat cleanly, actually, which is really interesting to me. And the Miria actually was covered in the news a long time ago. It was practically confirmed within the first week of the war that the Antonov 225 had been destroyed in its hangar by a stray artillery shell that landed somewhere on the airport. Well, actually, not somewhere on the airport. It went straight through the roof, but the hangar and onto the Antonov 225. Fortunately, as far as we know, none of the Antonov aircrews were injured or killed during this attack, but sadly, the aircraft was lost. Hopefully, the Ukrainians can manage to build back the Antonov 225, which was the largest aircraft in the world, and hopefully, we'll see one flying once again within the next few years. With that, we're now going to move on to the second bit of news, which I tried to condense a little bit because it was all really of the same I guess you could say, shade of news, and that's that the Finnish Prime Minister arrived in Ukraine today and actually surveyed the damage in the Irpin area and then briefly met with President Zelensky and discussed the situation. Of course, we know that Finland has been vying for NATO membership over the past few weeks as the war has shown that neutral countries within Europe better align to the western side or else they may face a Russian invasion. Here we can see a picture of the Finnish Prime Minister in Irpin, and her face looks incredibly disturbed by the disaster that has unfolded within this suburb of Kyiv. Here's the Finnish Prime Minister right here, Sanna Marin. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that name correct. And it also looks like there's a couple of her aides and maybe some Ukrainian bodyguards that are also with her. Of course, the entire world stands with Ukraine, and if any country knows the situation that Ukraine is in, it would be the Finnish, considering that they're almost in the pre-war situation that the Ukrainians found themselves in. And so hopefully these two neutrally aligned countries at the moment, although Ukraine has become very pro-Western and the West is supporting them a large amount, hopefully these two neutral countries can find common ground and footing, and hopefully the Finnish do not go the way of the Ukrainians and get dragged into a 3-month-long war with the Russian army. We're now going to move on. Sorry about the mispronunciation there. We're now going to move out of the Bucha Hostomel Irpin area, and we're now going to move to the border of Sumy, where we've actually seen an interesting little bit of news. Today we can see that Ukrainian MLRSs are in fact barraging Russian units on the other side of the border near the Sumy area, according to the caption on this post. This is something interesting to me, not something unheard of. We have seen a similar barrage near Belgorod, and it appears that the Ukrainians are trying to hit Russian units and forces on the other side of the border and make sure that they are shaken up a little bit, just so that way they don't get any rest. Here we can see that video of the MLRS in action. And so, that is the end of the video. It's very interesting to know that Ukraine not only launches the occasional ballistic missile or cruise missile attack into Russia, paired with the occasional daring helicopter raid, which we've seen one of, and it was actually successful. It now appears that they're also trying to hit Russian units with their conventional artillery like MLRSs. So there may be a small artillery battle that's occurring in the Sumy area, but we don't have any more information to go off of beyond this video alone. And so that would largely be an assumption. We're now going to move out of the Sumy area, and now we are going to move not into Russia, but straight into the location unknowns. Today is actually a very rare day. I don't think we've gone many days on this channel without some kind of international news, but this tells you how active the Frontline has been in Ukraine, is that I had to cut out the international news and also the Russian news to make sure that we could get to all of the occurrences that happened within Ukraine, most particularly around Kharkiv and Severodonetsk today. So we're now going to move on to the location unknowns. Starting off with our first bit of news, we can see a Stugna attack. It's everyone's favorite, and they've never left. We can see that once again, the Ukrainians are attacking Russian vehicles with a Stugna. Of course, this one has the Arabic interface on it, which tells us that this one is most likely a skiff. Same system, but different names, considering that this is the export model. And here's the video. As we can see, the Stugna is now on the way and traveling towards the Russian vehicle. We can kind of see the faint gray outline of the vehicle there in the trees. And we can see that it appears to be stationary. And I think he'll be staying stationary for a while longer after the Stugna hits right here. Any second now. Stugnas never fail. And there we go. This crew sounds a lot more calm and collected about the Stugna attack. It's like this guy's done it a million times before, so it's nothing new to him. So let's listen to his reaction again. All he says is got it. Yes, in Ukrainian means got it. So, a very interesting video. Of course, great to see that the Ukrainians are still managing to hit Russian units with Stugnas. And this appears to be another perspective from a drone of the exact same vehicle getting hit. Notice the trees are the exact same in this footage that they were in the Stugna's interface here. So, very interesting. You see, we actually got two perspectives of the same vehicle being hit, and that is once again another claim in the Ukrainian books of Russian losses. So great to see, and it's wonderful that we can see that the Stugnas are still being used on film. And so we're now going to move to our next bit of location unknown news, where we can see the Ukrainians hunting down more drones. The Ukrainians have a lust for technology, and in particular, they have a lust for destroying the incredibly backwards Orlan 10. We know that the Orlan 10s actually use a Nikon camera. You heard that right, and let me pull one up just for y'all to know what I'm talking about, just in case if some of y'all don't know what that is. A Nikon camera, much like these, is equipped inside of the Orlan 10, and just for y'all to know what an Orlan 10 looks like, now we're going down a rabbit hole, this is the Orlan 10. And so, there's a little camera, hopefully I can find one that'll show you all this. There's a little camera right somewhere in here, and it points downwards, and that's what they use to look at the ground, is a Nikon inside of an Orlan. We actually saw a Ukrainian take apart a couple of Orlans a while ago, and all of them had the exact same camera in it, a Nikon. So it's incredibly interesting to see, but that still does not mean that it's a less capable system. While it has a Nikon camera, Nikon cameras, of course, can look at the ground and report Ukrainian troop locations, much like any other camera. Apparently, there's a lot of people saying it was a Canon camera, so we will switch that, because I was looking at it and I thought I saw a Nikon, but apparently a lot of y'all know it was a Canon. Regardless, it is just a normal camera that a civilian can buy and use. That being said, the Orlan 10, just because it's using that camera, doesn't mean it's still not a potent system. It does have a camera that can look down at Ukrainian troops and their movements, and can report back to the Russians exactly where the Ukrainians are, and so destroying these drones is, of course, paramount in ensuring Ukraine's operational security. Here we can see some Ukrainian units going on a journey, and a mission, I guess you could say, to destroy as many Orlan 10s around the front lines as possible. Here we can now see them traveling through the brush. It actually looks like it's nearly in the same location as last time, which would lead me to assume that this is actually the same area, most likely around Severodonetsk, where we saw a brigade taking action against the Orlan 10s then. We can now see that some of the Piorns have been laid out on the ground, and we can now see them leveling them to fire, and firing them at the Orlans here in a second. We can now see them traveling through the brush once more. It really honestly seems like in every video we see of Orlan 10s being hunted down, it's nearly like a Wild West, well, not Wild West, kind of like an African safari journey on some kind of game hunt, as they have to travel through the woods and into the open to shoot this stuff down. We can now see that the Piorun's missile has been launched and hit the drone right out there, as you can see a small flash from the explosion. Let's check that out one more time. You can see the explosion right there, and that lets us know that this unit has shot down another Orlan 10 and has ensured that the Russians will not be able to use that drone to continue to collect vital information on Ukrainian forces and where they are. With that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of Location Unknown news, where we can see some U.S. and United Kingdom volunteers using an RGW-90. Just before we go into the video, an RGW-90 is an anti-tank system that is shoulder-fired. Here you can see an example of one of them. It's also called a Matador. And these anti-tank systems are about as competent and capable as all of the other systems that the Ukrainians have been provided by the West. Here we can see the US and UK volunteers using one, and also taking heavy fire, as it sounds like there's a large firefight unfolding near them. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly where this is on the front lines, but we do know that massive firefights, much like this one, have been occurring near the outskirts of Severodonetsk for the past 2 days. Here's the video.
Brian, you lead. Go, 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 go.
For a second there, this is a very interesting observation. You could actually hear in the distance a shot hit something and then ricochet. That little vibrating sound, if you could hear that through the microphone, that sound is actually the sound of a shell that has hit something, and it's, I guess you could say, flight has been destabilized and it's wobbling, and they tend to make that noise. So very interesting to hear, and let's hear that one more time, and then I'm going to let the video run through. Very interesting noise. We can now see the soldier with the RGW-90 in front of him, and we can also see this soldier moving forward. Actually, I think that's a different system entirely. That may be a law.
Get up the back bar. Up the back bar. Go, go.
We can now see that they fired the RGW-90 and got a direct hit on that
It's facing towards
BTR-60.
us. Pull back! Pull back!
We can now see that they shot the BTR, it seems, and it seems that the BTR actually stayed in action for a few extra seconds, because we could hear the soldier yelling, they're looking at us, and then we could start hearing fire opening up on their position. We can then hear the soldier yell, fall back, and it seems that the rest of the soldiers were trying to shoot and scooting away, although the withdrawal from the situation seemed to be somewhat slow. Still, of course, it's wonderful to see that US and United Kingdom volunteers are out there and fighting for Ukraine and representing the interests of pretty much the entirety of the Western world. So, of course, best of luck to him, and it was a solid hit with the RGW-90. Sorry, it's like an alphabet soup. It gets mixed up in my head. So with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of news, where we can see that a man was saved from a sniper shot, and it was by the helmet that I dog-owned the most. It was actually one of those Special Forces paratrooper helmets that is actually set up for a headset, and we can see that a bullet bounced right off the top, and the protective elements within it, most likely some kind of Kevlar or some kind of a ceramic, actually deflected the shot and made it ricochet, saving this man's life. So I'm actually going to have to take a step back now and not really dog on this helmet too much, because now we actually have photo evidence that it is useful in a way, and it's useful for shots that land near the top of the head. As we can see here, the bullet did ricochet. Great to know that the man's life was saved, and of course, he is probably very happy that that helmet actually saved his life as well. And so we're now going to move on to the next bit of Location Unknown news, where we can see that Italian howitzers have arrived. The Italians are known for the finer things in life. Ferrari, Dwar, all kinds of elaborate, fashionable things. And we can see that the Italians are also providing the Ukrainians with some very fashionable artillery in the form of the FH-70. Hopefully it is the Ferrari of the artillery, and will hopefully be used incredibly well by the Ukrainians. I can already see Enzo Ferrari very happy that the Italian legacy lives on in combat. Of course, we're going to pull up the RH-70 real quick and take a look, at least on its public information, about the system. So let's pull up the artillery, RH-70 artillery. Hang on. Let me make sure I got that right. Rheinmetall RH... Wait a minute. FH. I'm sorry, got that wrong. FH. So let's take a look at the information we have on this system. Here we can see that it's, of course, a 155mm shell. Of course, that is standard. That's what the M777 and the Caesar SPG uses. Apparently, it has an effective firing range of 15 to 18 miles, which makes it about as far-hitting and far-reaching as the M777. So I would say that this is Italy's Ferrari of the artillery, and hopefully the Ukrainians can use it incredibly well. And in this last picture, we can already see that they're putting it to good use as soon as possible. We're now going to be moving on to the next bit of Location Unknown news, where we can see the Ukrainians firing a captured mortar. This is kind of like a gun mortar. I would really call it more so of a howitzer, but apparently it's classified as a gun/mortar. So very interesting, but still, here's the video. We can see the Ukrainian soldier preparing it to fire, and then pushing the... I'm not really sure what that thing is called. I want to call it a pedal, that then, you know, of course, fires the piece. You can see it then get fired, and it looks like the crew may be a little short here. It doesn't look like they have a full crew for it, at least on film, but it is good to know that the Ukrainians are always putting captured equipment to use, and they also have the ammunition and the supplies to be able to field them. So, of course, great to see, and hopefully the Ukrainian artillery can keep up with the great work that they're doing. We're now going to move on to the next bit of Location Unknown news, where we can once again see more Ukrainian artillery in action. Here we can see a Ukrainian artillery piece. Unfortunately, I don't know what specific one this is. Hopefully someone in the comments knows. But we can see here the Ukrainian soldier point at the camera and then fire the piece. Very confident, and hopefully that confidence is carried over in the accuracy of the shot, because we know that Ukrainian artillery is some of the most accurate in the world based off of the video evidence we've been able to see. With this, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can actually see that a former Norwegian member of parliament has joined in the fighting and has volunteered in the Ukrainian armed forces. A very interesting moment. Apparently, this Norwegian member of parliament represented the Sumy people of Norway, which are actually one of the indigenous northern people of the country, and we can see here that she is fighting for Ukraine. Of course, a very interesting and high-level volunteer, considering that she was a former politician for Norway. This does add a lot of credibility to the cause, considering that someone who used to be a member of the government of Norway is actually there fighting for them. Incredibly interesting to see, and hopefully she does a great deal of help in the defense of Ukraine. Best of luck to her and the rest of the Norwegian volunteers that have entered the country. We're now going to move on to the last 3 bits of location unknown news, where we can see tonight the Ukrainian artillery has been hitting Russian targets, and it looks like it's about as dead on as normal. Of course, I do have to keep the video muted. There is copyrighted music. But as we can see here, there is a small Russian encampment within this crater. It appears to actually be a mortar pit. We can now see the Ukrainians shelling the area that these mortar pits are in, and hopefully hitting them dead on. We can now see the exact place that mortar pit was in, and it appears that the Russians may be having a slight nap. Of course, being under artillery fire that's that close is usually exhausting, and so I'm sure that they really do need a nap. Hopefully the Ukrainians can come through and put them in a nice bed underground, at least 6 feet under, because the Russians do like to stay somewhat chilled. Or maybe put them in a train. Of course, the Russians do like the cold weather, and refrigerated freight cars are a great way to provide that. We're now going to be letting the video finish out, so that way we can see the rest of it. And there we have it. So we're now going to move on to the next 2 bits, the last 2 bits of location unknown news, where we can see, once again, new artillery in the form of the FH-70 arriving in Ukraine. Here we can see some more pictures of the piece, and of course, incredibly interesting to see that the Italians have been providing artillery as well. And an interesting question I have when looking at this is, how much artillery do the Italians actually have? And I think that's a very interesting question to see. So let's pull that up real quick. The FH-70, hopefully we get some kind of production numbers here. Apparently it has a crew of 8. It's manufactured by a load of companies, including Rheinmetall, which is one of the, I guess you could say, leading defense companies in Germany. It was designed from 1968 to 1976, and it's been in service since 1978 and onwards. Let's see here if we can get any more information on the piece. Design, ammunition, current operators. Italy has 90 of these, and 162 of them have been ordered. And so I'm not really sure how many the Italians have sent, but once again, an incredibly good send by the Italians, considering that heavy artillery is something that the Ukrainians have been asking for, and it looks like a large amount of countries are starting to deliver on that request. So great to see, and we're now going to move on to the last bit of location unknown news, where we can see a Russian tank, as they call it in the modern world, goof maxing, as it runs over multiple Ukrainian mines in the middle of an open field. Of course, these kinds of events we haven't seen in a while. This is something similar to someone trying to run through a mailman trying to run through someone's front yard as a pit bull is chasing them down. It usually doesn't end well, and of course the pit bull always wins. So here's the video of this tank rolling over the Ukrainian minefield. As we can see, it seems somewhat determined, as it then ran over a second mine, and now we can actually see an artillery shell landing down and trying to finish the tank off. Now we can see that the smoke dissipated there at the end of the video while it's being rewinded, and you can see the defeated tank sitting there, most likely detract, maybe even having a puncture to the hull, which may have seriously wounded the crew, or started off a small ammo fire, which will of course lead into a massive bonfire. And so, I guess the best you could say is that one is most likely toasting, as of course a lot of people love to repeat, based off of one of my short clips where I saw the heavy mortar, the shield pond, blow up, and then I said toasty, and everyone's loved that one. So with that, that is the end of the location unknown news. Of course, in these clips, we've been seeing that the Ukrainians have once again been managing to inflict losses on the Russians, but as we get further on down, and make sure to stay with us tonight because this is the main point of tonight's stream, is talking about the Severodonetsk, Lyman, and Slovyansk area, as there have been some concerning reports and news that's come out of this area. And so with that, we're now going to start moving into the Kharkiv area, but before we do, we're going to answer 3 questions from the chat. Make sure to stick around because the news in the Kharkiv area, of course, is incredibly crucial to what's going on in the war right now, and then we will return back to the news. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
All right, so hello everybody, it is Enforcer Matt. Real quick before we move to our questions here, I just want to remind everybody that you do not have to put in a super chat to have a question answered. If you have a question for us, tag either me, at Enforcer Matt, or at the Enforcer, and we'll see your question and put it in the spreadsheet, and we'll try to answer it before the stream ends tonight. So first up on our super chat, so we have a $50 super chat from Paolo Corradini, who's a longtime channel supporter, as many of you know. He says, earlier tonight on the Shill live stream with Operator Starsky, they gave huge props to the Leaf Spring Army for having raised $330,000 for Ukraine. In case anyone is curious, the timestamp for the mention is 2 hours and 22 minutes. Thumbs up, y'all, and Slava Ukraine.
Well, I thank you very much for the support, Paolo. It does, of course, help out this channel, and I think that is one of the shining attributes here of our stream and what we do is that we've been able to manage to get so much help and support for Ukraine. Now, 330,000 isn't the exact number. It's actually, I think, somewhere around 270-something thousand right now, but it's within that ballpark, and hopefully within the future, we can actually reach 330, which would be 1/3 of a million, which would be huge to me, and I hope it would be huge to all of the rest of my viewers, because that is definitely an admirable goal. And one thing I've been looking into is trying to see about getting the Leaf Spring Army the recognition it deserves, because a lot of people have been out there getting recognition for doing far less, and I think that people like Naria and William Allen and all the other people who have supported these fundraisers so much should get the support that they deserve as well, considering that they've been doing loads of help for Ukraine along with the rest of this channel. So I thank you very much once again for the support, Paolo. It does help out this channel a lot. And with that being said, we're on to the next question.
And next up, we have a $20 donation from Smokey Valdez, who does not leave a comment. And thank you very much, Smokey, for your continued support. I know you're on the streams quite often, and we appreciate it very much. And moving on, we have a $20 donation from BC Skyman, another channel legend, who says, hello, Enforcer. Do we have any idea how much artillery has been sent to the Ukraine from each country? Also, how many artillery pieces does Ukraine need in order to effectively defeat Russia? Is there any chance that Ukraine will receive Predator drones?
Well, thank you very much for the support, but unfortunately, I'm going to have to already preface that one with, I don't have any idea of how many artillery pieces have actually been sent over and how many the Ukrainians need. Of course, that would be getting into the operational security of Ukrainian forces, which could put them at a disadvantage if the Russians know exactly how many artillery pieces have been provided by the West and exactly how many they need. So that kind of information, of course, I don't really have it, and it's not readily available to the public either for me to find out. So sadly, I'm going to have to declare ignorance on that one, because I just don't think the information's out there to say what they would need. But I do thank you very much for the support, and of course, you've been around for a while. Sadly, I can't answer that one. I wish I could, but due to a load of reasons, it can't be answered. But I do thank you very much once again. And could you read off the last part of that question for me real quick, Matthew, to make sure I cover every part of it?
Okay, so the first part was, do we have any idea how much artillery is being sent from each country? The second part was, how many artillery pieces does Ukraine need to defeat Russia? And the third part was, any chance that Ukraine will receive Predator drones?
Okay, to answer that last part, I want to make sure I didn't lose any part of it. To answer that last part, the answer to that is I'm not really sure. I don't know if that's qualified as aircraft in the Russians' eyes. I feel like it wouldn't be, considering that Ukraine has bought Bayraktars from Turkey. So I think that would be something up that I would think that would be a decision that would be made by the Department of Defense here in the United States, and I haven't ever heard them actually talking about the Predator drone, so I'm not really sure if that would be within the talks. It may be, but I've never heard any public information about it even being considered. So with that, I thank you so much for the support, and I hope that does answer the question. And with that, we're going to move on to the last question of the segment, and then we're going to move back into the Kharkiv and northern Donbass news. And so with that, what is the last question of this segment?
All right, and the last question of this segment goes to Stephen Safruk, who puts in a $17 donation and says, thank you for your well-rounded coverage.
and I thank you very much for the support, and I'm glad that you do enjoy the coverage here on this stream. Of course, I try and make sure that it's as neutral as possible, because, you know, well, not really neutral. I'm, of course, pro-Ukrainian, but the analysis as neutral as possible, because you can either go to one channel and get, like, pure Russian propaganda, or you can go to another channel and get pure Ukrainian propaganda. And while I am pro-Ukrainian, and I do believe that the Ukrainians are in the right and they should win, of course, looking at the actual situation on the ground, I try and remain as unbiased as possible and actually speak for what the situation is showing. And so with that, I thank you so much for the support. I'm glad that you do enjoy that aspect of this channel. And with that, we've reached the end of this question segment. If you have sent in a super chat, or if you're going to, do not fret. We do answer all of them by the end of the night, and we also get to some live chat questions as well near the end. So with that, we're now going to move on to the Kharkiv news and also the northern Donbass news, as a lot of information has been unfolding here, and I highly suggest y'all stick around through this whole entire segment, because these are the parts of the front lines that are very concerning right now, to say the least. So we're now going to move into the Kharkiv area. Starting off near the front line and between the Ukrainians and Russians, we can see that the Ukrainian artillery has been shelling Russian positions today. Let me go hop over to Twitter real quick to show this to y'all. So here we can see a burned out tree line and also some copyrighted music. But we can see a burned out tree line where the Russian units have been hiding. We can see that an artillery shell and a second one hit dead on into one spot in this tree line. We can now see the third shell landing and hitting further up the tree line, a fourth shell. And we can now see what appeared to be a Russian soldier crawling out of a foxhole near that explosion. We can now see even more shells raining down on this tree line. And based off of the subsequent burning of the grass nearby, I would assume that this isn't the first time the Russians have picked this exact same tree line to hide in, and we can see that they're once again regretting this decision, because, much like a third grader, they never really learn how to change their decisions, and they just keep on doing the same thing over and over. I actually believe that a better description would be is that these people are insane, because insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And based off of the amount of pop marks in this tree line alone, we can assume that they've been doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. We can now see them running into some craters, but it appears there's no avail because shells are landing right on top of those Russians, and then the video ends there. Once again, Starsky is always famous for saying that that these are being turned into good Russians, and at this point I'd have to agree. I think that these are certainly being turned into good Russians based off of the footage that we're seeing here. And so with that, we're now going to go and talk for a second about the situation on this Kharkiv front. It appears that the Russians have managed to stabilize this small salient north of Kharkiv, and they've actually stopped the Ukrainian advance. According to what I've been reading from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense's reports, that has been the case, and so I do not believe that we'll see the Ukrainians push the Russians out of this pocket north of Kharkiv anytime soon, considering that they've gotten enough pushback that they've now stopped their offensive. Moving on to the next bit of news, on the right side of the salient, we can actually see the 1st Brigade hitting an SPG with a Stugna. Of course, great to see. And it actually appears to be a repeat of the last video. So it appears I found a duplicate of the last one and actually got enough enough information to put a location to it. So we're not going to show that one again because that was shown in the location unknowns. And so we're now going to move on to the next bit of news. We've actually gotten some news from Kharkiv, and of course, this news is somewhat, I guess you'd say, infuriating and of course standard for the Russians. Now, Kharkiv has been moved almost entirely off the front lines. The closest front line to Kharkiv is now about 8 miles away, so a pretty good distance away. The Russians would have to manage to create a major breakthrough and cover nearly 8 miles in a single day to once again reach Kharkiv and the ring road that surrounds it. This has not stopped the Russians, though, from targeting Kharkiv with attacks directly on civilians, and also munitions that, when used on civilians, are considered an outright war crime. Here we can see the Russians using white phosphorus on the city of Kharkiv itself in the night. And so here's the video, and of course, it's evidence of more Russian war crimes. As you can see, the phosphorus is raining down on the outskirts of the city, most likely on civilian houses filled with people, and most likely causing serious injury, if not death, to those civilians. It's sickening to think that this stuff keeps on going, and there's really no end in sight at this point. This war looks like it's going to drag on for months now, and to think that the Russians will continue to do such sick things like this, it almost makes you think that the West should just get involved just for the sole reason of principle. But then again, that would lead us entirely into a world war. And so then the question becomes, would it be worth going into a world war to help out Ukraine? And everyone knows back in the day, I used to make large discussions and speeches pretty much about doing the right thing versus doing the thing that seems best. And, you know, of course, there's a little bit of a difference in between the two, but still, it's, of course, very disheartening and saddening to think that Ukrainian civilians and children are coming under such bombardments that are heinously conducted with the sickest kind of munitions on civilian areas once again. Very saddening to see, and it's very bothersome to me to think that it keeps on going. We're now going to move to the second bit of news we've got in Kharkiv, and it appears that there was a burning house somewhere today in the city. Of course, if we were to try and connect two and two together, one could assume that this was caused by the white phosphorus, but I haven't been able to confirm that information. All we see is a burning house.
Я не знаю, как его перекрыть. Он может там перекрыть, разве что. Да не, посмотри, тут нормально горит, блядь.
And so, of course, everything inside of the house has been burned out, and that's another family that's had their entire livelihoods, not livelihood, their entire lives destroyed, and something they'll never be able to return back to. The family that lived in that house is never going to return to the same house. Or if they do, it will never be the house they knew. And when you think about that, that's really sad to think that people's lives are still getting uprooted, even when their city is no longer on the front lines and no longer a direct point of contention for the Russians. So we're now going to move out of the Kharkiv area. We don't have any more news from that area. And we're now going to move near the Chuhuev area, where once again, we've gotten no information and no developments of any kind of activity here in this area. It appears largely that the front line here has fallen into stalemate, and it appears that it will remain in that condition for quite some while, as the Donetsk reservoir makes up most of this front line, and of course that would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for both sides to successfully cross. So we're now going to move past the area of Balaklia. Once again, we don't have any information to report from this area in particular. It's been largely quiet for the past week or two, and I believe it's going to stay that way for quite some while on. Now, we are getting on to the part of the news that is incredibly important and crucial in Ukraine's defense, and we're starting to see news that isn't exactly looking great. So, with that, make sure to pay great attention, because everything we cover here is the linchpin of everything that's happening on the front lines. The most activity is occurring here, and it's showing that the Russians may be making some ground. It may be threatening Ukrainian positions, which, while unfortunate to say, is what we're seeing unfold on the ground. Starting off in the area near Izyum at the village of Oskol, we can see that javelins have been used against Russian tanks here in eastern Ukraine. While the Russians have been attempting pushes and successfully conducting them, it appears that the Ukrainians are still not letting them advance without a fight, and here in these clips, we can see javelins being used against the Russians, for example, this one that hit a tank dead on, and also a second clip where it hits another tank dead on. We can actually see here in the distance a large amount of smoking and burning vehicles, and we can now see another one join the ranks right there. We can now see the Ukrainians once again aiming another javelin and firing it. And we can now see this one carry out beyond the tree line and hit a vehicle. Let's see where it is, right there in the film. So we can see that the Ukrainians continue to knock out Russian vehicles across the entirety of the front lines near Izyum. And so from this, we can largely assume that the front line there is remaining static. We haven't seen any advances from either side, and I believe that it's no longer in Russia's advantage, I guess you could say, to try and push anything from the Izyum area, as it's no longer a major axis that seems to be exploitable. So it appears that it'll largely just be a stalemate, and I guess you could say a resource pool of destroyed vehicles that the Ukrainians will be able to pull from. Moving on towards the Izyum area itself, we can see that a Russian barrage has occurred outside of Izyum near the front lines today. In this clip, we can see in some infrared footage some Russian artillery landing on what supposedly is a Ukrainian controlled area. Of course, we don't see Ukrainian soldiers on film, nor do we see Ukrainian vehicles, but we do see an artillery barrage landing in the distance from this IR film. Of course, the fire keeps raining down, but we don't really have any confirmation if there were Ukrainian units in that area. We didn't see any hardcore proof of it, and usually we like to verify things with actual proof that units have been hit. So fortunately, we didn't get any of that kind of report here, but we do know that the Russians are bombarding areas outside of Izyum, since that footage does indicate that. We're now going to move on to the part of the front line, well, actually two parts of the front lines, that have been looking somewhat questionable and somewhat risky. Starting off with the village of Lyman today, we've actually heard that Ukrainian forces have withdrawn from the city of Lyman. Apparently, the Russians were able to pull off a very quick offensive, which threatened the Ukrainians with encirclement there at the village of Lyman, and they had to withdraw. Here we can see a video of the Ukrainian forces withdrawing from Lyman today. Let me unmute this video, see if it has any copyright music. No, it does not. When you see this BTR-60 speeding down the road as fast as possible, and I also want to rewind it real quick so that way y'all can hear what's going on, you can actually hear fire coming from the tree lines surrounding this BTR as it's trying to speed through this, what was supposed to be an encirclement from the Russian side. But of course, due to the Ukrainian speed and professionalism, they were able to break through the encirclement and reach the Ukrainian forces on the other side, fortunately for them. So here's the video now, and I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to let y'all take in this very speedy withdrawal from Lyman to try and make sure that these forces were not encircled. Now, I know I said I was going to let the video run and not interrupt it, but there's some important things to note here. You can actually see something exploded in front of the tank, and it was so close, it actually knocked tree branches off of the nearby tree as the tank was passing by, and you can also hear very close shots, most likely from AKs, being fired at this BTR. Luckily, the Russians can't aim worth anything, and so they of course miss the Ukrainian soldiers entirely, thank God, but we can see that the shots are getting incredibly close. Let me show you all that one more time. Right up there on that tree, you see the branches falling off. Let me rewind that one more time. The video loaded. You see the branches falling off right there, showing how close the fire was getting. That was actually clipping branches off the trees.
Если мы выедем, блядь, дай бог. Сука. Здравствуйте.
And that's the end of the video. But there are, of course, a couple of important things to still note about this video. Notice that while the Ukrainians were actually coming under small arm fires on the back of a vehicle where they cannot dismount due to the speed, and notice how calm and collected they all were. They all kind of just leaned down on top of the tank, didn't really freak out, and they just got through it and got out the other side. At the end of the video, we could see that they made it into the clear, and apparently the Russian units were left eating their dust. And it's great to know that the Ukrainians have managed to reposition and not get encircled and lose more forces in an encirclement. So great to see, and it's good to know that the Ukrainian defenders are, of course, playing their cards very well. And while, of course, this is something very important to note, while Lyman has been captured today, this is not the end of the story. This does not mean that the Russians are going to push down to Slovyansk uncontested. They still have to contest with the Severodonetsk River, which the Ukrainians have most likely destroyed the bridge crossing at this point, which means that the Russians are now stuck on the other side, and to get across, they will have to conduct some kind of pontoon bridge crossing, which is incredibly dangerous for the Russians, very risky maneuver, and it most likely won't be able to be pulled off successfully. So, if anything, if the Russians are able to push down towards Slovyansk, they will most likely be stopped dead in their tracks at the Severodonetsk River. We're now going to move on to the next bit of news we've gotten from the Lyman area, where we can see that the Ukrainian forces somewhere in the forests nearby have repelled the Russians. And so while they did take the city of Lyman, it does appear that defensive positions were set up right outside of the city, and they did manage to inflict heavy losses on the Russians and at least stop their advance for today. Here's that video.
Пулеметчику передати, хто ще похуярив всіх.
Вот так вот, ебать, мы поебашились сегодня с пидорами. Но у них нихуя не получилось. Опять пробовали с танчика, ебать, нас ебануть. О, пулеметчик, Бодя, это ебейший чувак, ебать.
Барон.
Барон, сука, перехуярил почти всех пидоров. Ну, короче, вот так десантура воюет, ебать. Ни шагу назад.
Завжди перші.
Все буде Україна.
As you can see, there's a fire there in the distance, and we could also just see them surveying the carnage left afterwards. And we can see multiple trees that were cleaved clean through, and the tops of the trees just fell over onto the ground. And that tells you how large the caliber of rounds that were being fired at them was, and also how fierce the firefight was, considering that almost every single tree in this forest has been left damaged and has some kind of scars of the battle that just unfolded. So it's great to know that the Ukrainians, of course, have pushed the Russians back into Lyman for a bit. We're not really sure how the situation is unfolding. It does appear that the Russians have had the momentum for the past few days, and so this may just be a little bit of a delaying tactic to make sure the Russian advance does not continue as fast as it normally would. Of course, I'm not going to go into what the Ukrainians are doing or might be doing, because that could, of course, give away Ukrainian plans and, of course, hinder them in the future. Finally, in this last clip of news that we've gotten from the Lyman area, we can see some Humvees of the Ukrainian forces moving rapidly around the area of Lyman. I'm not really sure if these were trying to break through an encirclement as well, but we can see them moving with great speed around the city. Here's that video. We can see them sitting on a BTR. Actually, yes, that is a Humvee. I just wanted to make sure real quick. And it's wonderful to know that the Ukrainians move with incredible speed around the entirety of the front lines. Of course, speed is key in modern warfare, and we can see that it's never been lost on the Ukrainians as they continue to exhibit the fastest speed in their maneuvering. And so hopefully they can manage to regain the defensive positions around Lyman and hopefully push the Russians back out. While the Russians have supposedly taken the entire village, as I've seen today, that may not be the case. Of course, I always have to note that there is a fog of war, and my news could be wrong, but as far as I've been able to collect today, it sounds like the Ukrainians have been pushed entirely out of Lyman. And that brings us on to another topic, the rail yard in Lyman. Considering that the Russians now control it, some people may be assuming that the Russians will just start to funnel in units straight into Lyman by railroad, and their supply lines may be greatly, I guess you could say, de-stressed due to this fact. The problem is that the Ukrainians control all of the railroads going into Lyman from both directions right now. And so the chances of that happening is very slim. That rail yard has pretty much just been put out of operation, but of course the Ukrainians have rail yards further back that can help out their supply lines just like Lyman did. We're now actually going to move to some news that occurred further back behind the lines. Of course, we don't know exactly where. This would be giving away Ukrainian locations if I put it exactly where they are. But we can see today that the Ukrainians have been using artillery overtime, trying to attempt to cause massive damage to Russian units and slow their pushes, or maybe put them entirely into a rout. Here we can see some of that MLRS fire occurring at night. And I have to mute it. Now we can see the MLRS firing. I'd also like to suggest to some people, because I see a lot of people in the chat every once in a while trying to say what the Ukrainian plans are. Remember that loose lips do sink ships, and so while it's always great to talk about how the Ukrainians can counter the Russian attacks, you could, of course, be giving the Russians information that they may have not known. One does have to remember that while people, of course, can view themselves as a nobody that maybe the Russians wouldn't pay attention to, much like I kind of think about this channel sometimes, the Russians are listening everywhere, and so giving out information like that could, of course, be detrimental to Ukraine's defense and give the Russians the heads up on what they might be doing. So I highly suggest that people in the chat, because I saw a few that are talking about what the Ukrainians are probably going to do, I would suggest not to, because that could be killing the Ukrainians you're trying to talk highly about. So be careful with that, just making sure that we send that message out again. We're now going to be moving on to the next bit of news that has also occurred somewhere near the Slovyansk and Lyman area, where we can see a D-30 firing at the Russians. Of course, the Ukrainians have been operating the D-30, a former Soviet artillery system, since the very start of this war, and we can see here that they are still using D-30s, hopefully to a great deal of success. We know that Ukrainian artillerists were accurate with the D-30 at the start of the war, and hopefully that accuracy has carried over, although newer and more accurate artillery systems have been provided to the Ukrainian forces, such as the M777, the FH-70, and also the Caesar SPG, among many others. And we can see that they put out 3 rounds at incredibly quick speed, 3 rounds in under a minute. Very decent pace, and hopefully those rounds are landing on target. Of course, I don't have any doubt with Ukrainian artillery that every time we see them firing a round, it's almost always landing on target. Also, another thing that I wasn't going to mention until now is that for some reason my throat is really dry tonight. I don't know why, but it is making it a little bit tougher for me to talk. So if my inflections sound a little bit off, that is the reason why. Just want everyone to know in advance. And so we're now going to move back up towards the Lyman area and also towards the Torske area, where we have seen another interesting development as the Ukrainians have taken out one of Russia's finest armored personnel carriers, a BMP-3. Here we can see the footage of the Stugna being used. We can now hear the Stugna get fired, and we can see that the operator, who has eagle-like vision with those glasses, of course I wear glasses as well, we can see that he is guiding in the shot to this BMP-3.
Попали!
And we can see that it hit dead on, and the crew does celebrate. It's of course great to see that the Ukrainians are still knocking out Russian tanks with the Stugna. I say this almost every time we see this film, but there's really no other way to say it, that it's just great to see the Stugna knocking out more Russian tanks. I guess you could say that the Russians are shook by the Stugna. So with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of news further back behind the lines, of course in an unknown location in its exact nature, but we do know that it happened somewhere in eastern Ukraine. Here we can see a 2S-1 operated by Ukrainian forces firing at the Russians. Of course, we usually see a decent amount of these SPGs being used by the DPR and LPR forces, but here we can see the Ukrainians using one of their own, and apparently it is something to take your hat off about and respect, because this man's hat went flying as soon as the gun was fired. Check it out. It's like it wasn't even there. So now he's going off to grab the hat, and we could see that SPG does have a decent amount of, I guess you could say, energy when it fires, as the actual just air being pretty much moved about by the gun firing was enough to blow that man's hat off like it was a tornado outside. Take a look at that, jeez. So with that, of course, great to see. And we can actually see for a second there, I think one of the Ukrainians was trying to push the shell, or at least open the hatch to push the shell out of the top. Wonderful to see, and hopefully the Ukrainian artillery is doing a great job in pummeling the Russian forces. We're now going to start moving towards Severodonetsk and then further down the front to a very precarious situation that has been developing over the past day. Starting off near the only bridge that is still there in between Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which is actually an interesting situation here because there's apparently only 2 or 3 bridges that actually connect Severodonetsk with Lysychansk, and we've actually gotten enough information to know that pretty much all of the bridges that are directly in between Severodonetsk and Lysychansk have been destroyed. I believe the only one that's still here is the one that's closest to the Russian front lines, as the location did seem to line up with the information I was able to get earlier, and we can see a journalist filming this last bridge and coming under fire as the Russians are still attempting to knock out this bridge completely. And so, here's the video.
Оця машина сьогодні знищена отут близьким пострілом, підбита. Ось сюди прильот, це буквально, от, ви чуєте обстріл. Противник веде постійний обстріл цього міста. Просто постійний. Під постійним вогнем вже зараз. розбиті машини, прямі влучення ми бачимо, все розтрощено. Ось як це виглядає. Проїзд тут вже дуже обмежений, вже
You now see him walking back up to the
не
bridge.
проїдеш тут на швидкості, тому що дивіться, в якому стані покриття цього мосту. Ось тут повністю це проломи, прямі влучення снарядів. До речі, все це
Well, you now see him looking through a couple of holes in the
кілька
bridge,
днів, стільки
most
не
likely
було.
caused by artillery.
Вирв. Дивіться, скільки вирв. Тут вже на швидкості не проїдеш. Міст в дуже поганому стані. І противник намагається повністю його знищити. Ось ще одна вирва. Це інформація, щоб можна було передивитися.
As we, of course, you can see clearly that the damage to this bridge has been extensive. You can see that a large amount of the railing on the sides has been blown off. There are, of course, gaping holes in the actual tarmac on top of the bridge, and it looks like it's in general disrepair. And this is the condition of the last bridge in the Severodonetsk area. And we'll, of course, cover the importance of this bridge later on in a second.
Обстановки. Що з цим мостом? Дивіться, ось в такому він стані. Ось ще пряме влучення. Тобто, хочу сказати, що це пристріляні противником позиції. Цей міст – це планова ціль для російської артилерії. Російська авіація теж намагається завдати ударів. Ось останнє, що тут ми зараз покажемо на в'їзді до цього мосту, це удари російських авіабомб. Тобто ми бачимо наслідок авіанальоту. Дивіться, свіжі.
We now see more craters that have been caused by artillery strikes very close to the bridge.
Тобто сюди були завдані удари, противник, очевидно, хоче повністю зруйнувати міст. Застосовує для цього ось такі.
And now we can hear the fire coming in close nearby as the Russians appear to be attempting to shell the bridge again while this journalist is here. Of course, that was incredibly close, and the screech of the shell, of course, panicked the journalist, as it would with anyone who's reasonable. That shell was incredibly close. Now we can see the journalist hightailing it out of there and trying to make sure that he does not end up as battered as the bridge.
Планова ціль. Це планова ціль.
Только скорее.
Да, ну отак. В такому стані ці мости. І ось це дві лінії, дві тоненьких ниточки, на яких тримається ціле місто Северодонецьк з великою кількістю наших підрозділів.
And that is probably one of the most harrowing things we've seen from a journalist over the course of the past 2 days. I mean, like, we've seen another journalist, well, actually a group of journalists, come under fire much like this on the Severodonetsk-Bakhmut highway, but we've never seen one sound that fast and that close. Usually there was a long screech on the ones we saw a few days ago that kind of gave you a few seconds of a notice that they were coming in, but that one was literally just a split second, and then the explosion occurred just 50 yards from them. Incredibly close, and it's great to know that they didn't manage to get out of there unscathed, but the Russians destroying the last bridges in between Severodonetsk and Lysychansk are threatening some Ukrainian positions. For example, the armor has no way to cross the river anymore. The Ukrainians, if they wanted to conduct a withdrawal, would most likely have to leave their armor behind or destroy it. And so I'm not sure how much armor the Ukrainians have on this other side of the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk area. But if it is a sizable amount, they could be losing some of it if the Ukrainians did have to conduct a withdrawal over the river. Not to get too much into what the Ukrainians are doing, planning, or thinking, but that is a very concerning situation. The Ukrainians, of course, are probably looking into the situation and trying to find a way to make sure that the Ukrainians on the other side in Severodonetsk can stay well supplied and keep the fight going, but still, it seems that it will be an uphill battle for the Ukrainians near Severodonetsk. But we know that the Ukrainians are up to the challenge. We've seen historically that they've been able to do the impossible so far, and so I have no doubt in their abilities to hold Severodonetsk for an incredibly long time, if not through the duration of the war. We're now going to move on to the next bit of news outside of Severodonetsk in the woods today, where we can hear once again that large firefights, and I'm talking massive firefights, take a listen to this, are occurring on the outskirts of the village, well, the city. While we haven't actually heard, well, while we don't actually see the firefight, you can hear it, and it is unbelievable. Here's the video.
Идет жесткий бой. Пидоры атакуют. РПГ хуярит. Слава Украине, выживем, будем жить.
And so we can see that Ukrainian soldier, of course, very calm and collected, just wandering around the field and letting everyone see what's going on out there. And it's great to know that while that firefight is massive, I mean, like, that's one of the largest we've ever heard on film. It's good to know that the Ukrainians, of course, stay professional and collected during these firefights, as that does help out with their unit cohesion and also being able to defend. Because if you're freaked out, you, of course, can't do your job as well as you would if you were, you know, of course, calm and composed. So with that, we can see that large firefights are still occurring on the outskirts of Severodonetsk, and hopefully, the end result of these firefights is that Ukraine is managing to hold their defensive positions outside the city and make sure the Russians do not have an easy time trying to actually attack Severodonetsk itself. We're now going to start moving south and into another precarious and threatening situation to the Ukrainian lines. But before we do, we're actually going to visit this little bit of news here on this country road, where we can see Ukrainian MLRS at work. Of course, this is not giving away the exact location of a Ukrainian unit. I, of course, make sure not to really know where exactly Ukrainian units are on this channel. But here's the video of this MLRS in action somewhere in the Severodonetsk area. Wonderful to see that the Ukrainian artillery is still working and that they are still well enough supplied that they're using them to a large degree these days, as we've seen MLRSs and artillery being fired across the length of the entire front line as of today. With that, we're now going to move on to the actual threatening news itself, and so this is what's been concerning. We've gotten information today that the Russian forces have reached the town of Vasilivka, which is only a mere 1.5 miles away from the T-1302 highway. The Ukrainians have held the Russians at Vasilivka and have not allowed them to go any further, but they are put dangerously close to one of the only two supply lines that make it to Lysychansk. Either the Ukrainians have to take the T-1302, which is called the Bakhmut-Lysychansk Highway, or they have to take the highway that heads towards Severodonetsk and then take a country road to then get to Lysychansk. And so, due to how close this front line has gotten to the T-1302, I'm most likely assuming that it's been put out of action for the Ukrainians, and all supplies will have to be traveling down this single highway, which is of course a very threatening situation for the Ukrainians, considering that all of the supplies for the entirety of this front line have to travel down one road. The amount of supplies that the Russians can attack in one area will increase, which is dangerous on its own, and on top of that, the Ukrainians will have to negotiate a country road, which of course is not as well kept and not as large and can accommodate as much traffic as a highway. So in those regards, the Ukrainians might start seeing a little bit of difficult times in terms of supply in the Severodonetsk and Lysychansk area, which will of course make it more difficult for it to hold. Of course, we are hoping that the Ukrainians can manage to control the situation down here and create something good out of it. Here in Vasilivka today, we can actually say that the Wagner group was hitting Ukrainian forces, which is indicating proof that the units here in this area must be advancing as they are hitting Ukrainian forces. And so this kind of gives me the verification to know that the Russians reaching Vasilivka may be true, because this is one of the first times that we've seen Russian footage that actually shows them hitting Ukrainian forces on film. Here we can see the Ukrainian soldiers moving down the side of a road. And we can now see that unit was unfortunately hit dead on. And this footage is, of course, very difficult to watch. These poor guys are trying to defend their country. And, of course, stuff like this does unfortunately happen. Hopefully not a lot of them were killed. Hopefully just injured. But that explosion was fairly dead on to their unit. And so, very unfortunate to see. Hopefully this doesn't hinder the Ukrainians' defenses in this area too much. And hopefully a lot of them were able to get medical care later on after this video was over. This is war, and of course everything that we see in war is not going to be something we want to see. And it really pains me to see this kind of stuff, knowing that I have friends in Ukraine that I know, and also I know Operator Starsky, who's in the in the Ukrainian military, and that these are his friends as well. And so I hate to think that, and hopefully the Ukrainians are able to hold these lines and make sure that the Russians do not interdict the supplies that have to travel down this important highway. And so with that, we're now going to move further back behind the lines, where we've gotten a questionable caption today, and also some questionable reporting on this, as the caption today says that the Russians fired at a Ukrainian bunker at Zolote, but the problem is that the front line, according to our information, is now some 11 miles away from this village at the farthest. And so I'm not really sure if this reporting is true, but that's where the video was located to, and we can see today the Russians firing an ATGM at this bunker in the distance. We can see them here hitting the bunker. But the thing is that if the Russians have located this, and then this person posted this as saying Zolote, that means that there's no Ukrainians in the area, because the Ukrainians are around 7 miles away at the least. And so it appears that if that is the case, the Russians may be attempting to make propaganda well behind the lines, in safety, and hitting former Ukrainian bunkers that were once occupied. Of course, we didn't have any confirmation that Ukrainian forces were there, and so we can't actually confirm that information. But since it's so far behind the front lines, we can generally get the idea that there were definitely no Ukrainians there. So with that, we can see that the situation here on the front lines is starting to develop into a situation that is putting Ukraine in a decent amount of jeopardy. And here's something that I have to say, is that while it does appear to be a little bit risky right now, one does have to remember that, one, you can lose battles, but you can still win a war, and two, the Ukrainians are on the defensive. The Ukrainians don't always have to be gaining ground to be considered winning. The only thing the Ukrainians have to do in a defensive war is hold their ground and wear down the attacking force until they can no longer carry on. So while this information, of course, is concerning, I just want everyone to know this isn't the end, per se. It's not like the Russians captured Lyman and are interdicting the supplies on the T-1302, and the war is just going to end and the Ukrainians are going to get slaughtered in this area. That's not the case. Of course, this could start dragging out into a very long, drawn-out battle and situation. And considering that the Ukrainians, of course, have the Severodonetsk River to rely on as a defensive barrier, the Russians may be met with very little success in the future once they actually push the Ukrainians back to that river, if they do. So keep that in mind, and just don't worry about it too much, because the Ukrainians will try and control the situation the best they can and ensure that the Russians do not capture as much ground as they are right now. And so we've now covered all of the Kharkiv and northern Donbass news. So we're now going to move on to the next bit of news here in the south. Well, actually, the rest of the news in the southern front, and finally the speech from President Zelensky. But before we do, we're going to answer 3 questions from the chat, and then we're going to move on to the southern front news, the speech from Zelensky, and wrap up the news for the night. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
All right, so up first we have a $50 donation from D. Shaw, who says, what is the long run from Mariupol when electronic filtration billboards, Russian flags, etc., mean for the recapture by Ukraine? What would Ukrainians do when Russians take out these sorts of territories?
Could you tell me what that means? Because I think I kind of lost it in translation.
Let's see. What is the long run from Mariupol when electronic filtration billboards? I'm not really sure what he means, really.
I think I may know what he's talking about, so let me try and answer that question to the best I can. Sorry if it's kind of being lost on us, but I am having a hard time understanding that one. But in the long run for Mariupol, we do have the electronic billboard trucks on news today. It's actually the only news we've gotten out of Mariupol, so we will be covering that. And as far as the long run, I don't think any Ukrainians are actually going to buy that kind of stuff because they've lived through the war. This isn't something that's far away from them or where the Russians just rolled through and there was no firefight or anything. The Ukrainians there have actually seen how staunch and how resilient Ukrainian defense can be, and so I don't really believe they'll be buying up that propaganda all too much. So I hope that answers that part of the question. Can you bring us on to the next part of the question, Matthew, and try and help me know what that means?
So it looks like some people in the chat are saying that he's asking what will happen to Mariupol in the long run, and I think he's saying that Russian flags and, propaganda billboards are there. I'm just not sure how that ties into the question, but the last part said, what would Ukrainians do when Russians take these sort of territories?
What would the Ukrainians do when they take these territories?
Russians.
I think that kind of answered the question of what they're already doing. They're already in there trying to make sure that their propaganda is as strong as possible and starting, I guess you could say, to Russify the local population and try and make them, I guess, assimilated into Russian culture and being Russians, at least in a very fast crash course kind of way. So I thank you very much for the support, and I hope that does answer the question. I'm sorry if I couldn't answer it too well. Unfortunately, I didn't really understand it all too well, but I do thank you very much for the support. And with that being said, we're going to move on to the next question.
And I just want to say thank you, D. Shaw, for the support, and hopefully we did answer it the best we could. So up next, we have a $14 donation from Rodnoff Claw, who says, yes, loose lips sink ships. With that being said, I have a great idea for the Russian soldiers. Turn eastwards and walk as far as you can. All the way, go, go, go. You will reach this place called home. Stay there. Good boy.
Well, I thank you very much for the support, and I do like the little joke. Of course, we can see a lot of times that whenever artillery lands around the Russians, they do take that to heart and they try and run home as fast as possible. And so I thank you very much for the support, and I hope that does address the comment. And of course, we do like a joke here or there. And once again, sorry everyone, I'm trying to make sure that my voice hangs in here, so I'm trying to not fluctuate as much as I normally would, because honestly, it's feeling pretty rough right now. And so with that, I thank you very much for the support. I hope I answered that comment, and with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And next up, we have a $12 donation from Junebug, who says, what a marathon this is. Just a little gratitude tip, as you both work so hard. I hope the stormy weather is calming down, and Slava Ukraine, Heroam Slava.
And I thank you very much for the support. Of course, you've been a long-time channel supporter, and it helps us out a lot. Of course, we rely entirely on the generosity of our viewers and helping us to support ourselves and keep on running this news. So, of course, we're always very appreciative to anyone who sends in support, because any amount helps us to keep these streams running. To answer that question, to address it, it is quite a marathon, just in the fact of how many days we've been running this thing. We only take off 1 day a week, and we've been doing that for, golly, let me think. We've been doing that for several days. We take a day off each week for about 6 weeks. So subtract 6 days from that number, from 92. and we've been streaming for pretty much 86 days straight. Each stream is around 3 hours long, and so we've almost put out nearly 270, most likely, hours of content and streams and news about this war. And in that perspective, it's definitely been a marathon, and I feel like that number is going to keep on going up because this war doesn't appear that it'll be ending anytime soon. And so with that, I thank you very much for the support. I'm glad that you do support us. It does help us out a lot and helps us to keep running these streams. And with that being said, I believe that's actually the last question of this segment, if I'm correct, Matthew.
Let's see here. I think that was the second.
All right, and so we'll move on to the last question of this segment, and then we'll return to the Southern Front news and then the speech from Zelensky and wrap up tonight's stream.
All right, so the last one of this segment goes to Jose Trujillo, who puts in a $10 donation and says, Poland bought Abrams, won't arrive until 2025. What if the U.S. loaned them 200 Abrams until theirs arrived, allowing them to send more of their older tanks to Ukraine?
That would be a pretty interesting idea. That's something that I believe the United States should look into, but at the same time, the United States has been, well, that's actually a very good point. The Marine Corps actually retired all of their M1A1s. So they could give those to the Poles, and then the Poles could send their older equipment to Ukraine. Or we could circumvent that entire thing altogether and just send the M1A1 straight to Ukraine. You know, any way we manage that could work. And while a lot of people have high regards for the M1 Abrams, I hate to say it, but in Iraqi hands, there were a lot of Abrams lost. The Iraqis have actually managed, I believe, to lose about 500 Abrams tanks fighting the fighting ISIS, and also I think the Kurds as well, because for a short while the Kurds were doing their thing in northern Iraq. So I hope that kind of addresses the question in multiple ways, and then kind of once again brings into question, were the M1s that the United States sent to Iraq, were they weakened in any way? Or did they have armor removed? I wouldn't believe so. That would be kind of a little bit weird. And at the same time, that also brings into question, are those tanks viable as well? I mean, like, anything's better than nothing. And of course, M1 Abrams are some of the best tanks in the world as of right now. And so hopefully they would be much better than their Eastern counterparts, which we can count on for sure. There's a whole bunch of benefits to the M1 Abrams that you don't get with an Eastern tank like the T-72 or the T-80. So I thank you very much for the support, and I hope that does answer the question. And with that, we've now reached the end of this question segment. If you have sent in a super chat, do not worry. We do answer every single one of them by the end of the night. And I want to say that every time we end one of these question segments, because sometimes some people think we're ignoring their super chats, and we don't. We will answer everyone's super chat that does have a question to them, and we thank everyone so much once again for sending them in, because without y'all's support, we simply cannot keep this channel running. And so with that, we're now going to return back to the Southern Front news, which we have a small amount of, and then we'll wrap up with the speech from Zelensky. Starting off in the area near Avdiivka, we can see some Russian Su-25s flying incredibly low over the steppes and over this person who is filming them. This, of course, was filmed just today, and so here is the footage. This thing goes over in a flash. Very interesting to see, and of course, we've seen a lot of Su-25 action from both the Ukrainians and the Russians, and it appears that both sides are fielding massive amounts of close air support aircraft and ground attack aircraft to try and help them push the advances and the defensive positions on both sides. We're now going to move further down the front, as we've actually gotten no more news from the Donetsk area. The area has fallen completely silent today as far as video evidence, and so we can't actually ascertain what the situation is on the ground as far as video evidence as of today. We're now going to move on into Mariupol, where today we've seen that the Russians are rolling in more propaganda trucks. These trucks are specially made with TVs installed on the side, and they broadcast pure propaganda to the local population. Here's a video of one of these in use.
Оказание медицинской помощи. Медицинские учреждения. Правый берег.
Итогом 2022 считать товарооборот, вероятно, будут уже в рублях. Если бы не сдался, Я не знаю, куда ты делся.
Основной укрепрайон в Мариуполе. Снаряды, которые могут взорваться в любой момент на каждом шагу. Теперь Азовсталь полностью под контролем народной милиции ДНР и российской армии. Азов сохраняет жизнь экипажа. Он очень эффективно зачищает местность. Опасными веществами.
I like how they film these two guys. I'm assuming that most of these people are most likely some kind of actors or something similar. I like how these two guys just look at each other and nod like, that's right. Like, what in the world does that mean? Like, this was just weird and kind of seems a little bit staged, if I'm going to be honest here. So let's look at that one more time.
Сохраняет жизнь экипажа. Он очень эффективно зачищает местность.
What was that?
Веществами троллим, хотя и не весь Украина.
Да, спасибо большое. На прямой связи из Луганска была наш корреспондент.
24 и даже на каналейшим нашим праздником Днем Победы.
В сочетании с ветром нет пожароопасную обстановку.
Мая 8. Городская больница номер 2. 071 331 76 04. 526 92.
You know, it's crazy to me. It's almost like 1984. They literally rolled in a Big Brother TV and just started broadcasting that stuff in front of the civilians that they've now occupied their city with. That's really weird and bizarre to me, and it's also freakish to think that the Russians go through that level of filtering and giving people propaganda like that. We also know that they're doing like a purge, like what they're calling a filter, where they pretty much fingerprint every single Ukrainian that's now in occupied territory, so that way they can figure out if they were formerly Ukrainian soldiers or police, and then have those people quote-unquote filtered, which most likely means liquidated or deported to Russia. And also, it supposedly helps them to find criminals quicker, which, you know, that could be anything. That, of course, could be people who are just speaking out against the Russians. So I pray that the people who are now within Russian-occupied territory are not treated incredibly poorly. We already know in the Bucha Hospital European area that they were executing civilians like it was going out of style or something, and that's just really sick to think about, and hopefully they're not going to start doing the same thing to those poor citizens of Mariupol who have already been through enough, and now a different kind of hell is probably going to unfold for them under Russian occupation. Really sickening to think about, honestly, and it's crazy to think that there are countries out there in the modern world doing stuff like this. And so with that, we've actually covered all the news in Mariupol, and we're now going to move on to the northern part of the front, near the village of Vorzhyany, where we can see that Ukrainian soldiers came under fire today from Russian artillery. Here we can see one of the Azov soldiers. Of course, there's not just one Azov unit that was in the Azovstal steel plant. There are also several others around the country, and here we can see one of the soldiers from one of the Azov units hunkering down in a foxhole as artillery lands so close nearby that it actually pretty much bathes them with dirt from the explosion. So here's the video. Now that was really close. It's insane to me to think about, you know, and I say this every time, and of course it's probably getting a little old, but still, it's something that I think about every single time, that these soldiers are going through this stuff and they keep going. When you really see that on video, instead of just reading about it in a book or hearing a story from a veteran, and you actually see what they go through on video, and then they keep on going, it's honestly unbelievable, and it's crazy to think that people will persevere through that kind of thing, and it does give a testament once again to the patriotism of the common Ukrainian soldier and how well they conduct themselves in the battlefield and how much they believe in the defense of their country. With that, we're now going to move further on down the line, and we're now going to move to our last bit of news before we get to the speech from President Zelensky, which occurred somewhere in the Kryvyi Rih pocket today. Here we can see the 36th Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces in action and fighting the Russians. So here's the video, and I hope y'all do enjoy. It's a pretty nice one. Of course, I do have to keep it muted because it does have copyrighted music. But as you can see here, the Ukrainians are placing down what appears to be a mortar pit. We can now see them preparing the mortar rounds for firing. And we now see them highlighting Russian soldiers on the side of a tree line. We can now see them hanging the round and firing. The mortar is now fired. And we can now see the first round coming in on film. Wait a minute. Correction. We've seen the mortar fire again, and now we see the rounds coming in on film. And we can see that they're landing right on top of those Russian soldiers that were spotted in the tree line just a second ago. And of course, hitting dead on. We can now see a small little ammo cook-off occurring over there as the little tracers popped out of the boxes and began to burn on the ground. And we can now see some of the Russians in the tree line here, and it doesn't look like some of them are in too good of shape. So the Ukrainians have once again managed to inflict damage on the Russian units, and hopefully they're able to continue on with that kind of effect. We don't really know about the news down here in the Kherson area. We, of course, haven't gotten any news there. It appears that the front line has largely stalled, and also it appears to be the same up here in the Kryvyi Rih pocket, as there's been no activity beyond the 36th Brigade knocking out some infantry today. So it largely seems, honestly, that the whole entire southern front has completely ground to a halt on both sides. I believe this is because the Russians are now lacking the logistical ability to push offensives in every direction, and so now they've completely focused their efforts on these two minor advances near Lyman and Popasna, heading towards the T-1302, and also trying to head towards Slavyansk. So, of course, very interesting to see, and it is something important to note. And so with that, we're now going to move on to our final bit of news today. Of course, we round out every single stream with the exact same bit of news. It is the speech from the man, the myth, the legend, the revered, renowned, and most famous at this point, President Volodymyr Zelensky, as he gives his speech on the 92nd day of this war. And so, I'm not going to interrupt this speech. I'm going to let it run in its entirety. And here it is. The speech from President Volodymyr Zelensky.
Українці, українки, усі наші захисники і захисниці рівно 8 років тому, 26 травня, припинив роботу Донецький аеропорт. Досі збереглось повідомлення про це. Увага! З 7 ранку аеропорт Донецьк тимчасово призупиняє обслуговування рейсів. Про відновлення роботи аеропорту буде повідомлено додатково. Того дня, мабуть, ніхто взагалі не передбачав, як будуть розвиватись події на Донбасі протягом цих років. А потім і у всій Україні після повномасштабного вторгнення. Ніхто не передбачав, наскільки і як затягнеться слово «тимчасово» в цьому оголошенні про зупинку аеропорту. Але і того дня, і в будь-який день потім, і сьогодні можна впевнено сказати дві речі. Перше, Україна завжди буде незалежною державою, і її не зламати. Питання лише в тому, яку ціну доведеться заплатити нашому народу за свою свободу, а Росії за цю безглузду війну проти нас. І друге, катастрофічне розгортання подій все ж таки можна було би зупинити, якби світ поставився до ситуації в Україні як до своєї ситуації. Якби сильні світу цього не загравали з Росією, а реально натиснули заради припинення війни. Ось просто погляньте на ситуацію зараз. Скільки вже тижнів Європейський Союз намагається узгодити 6-й пакет санкцій проти Росії, поки вона отримує від європейців майже по $1 мільярду на день за постачання енергоресурсів. Звичайно, я вдячний нашим друзям, які просувають нові санкції, але звідки взялося стільки могутності у тих, хто блокує 6-й пакет? Чому їм досі дозволено мати стільки могутності, зокрема і у внутрішньоєвропейських процедурах? Скільки вже тижнів світ не наважується заблокувати російську банківську систему? Усі банки без виключення, щоб позбавити агресора можливості фінансувати не тільки війну проти нас, але й політику створення розколів і криз повсюди у світі. Скільки вже часу ми боремося, щоб Україні надали всю зброю, яка необхідна, щоб змінити характер боїв і почати рухатись швидше і більш впевнено до вигнання окупантів. Всю зброю, включно з МЛРС, з тими системами, які реально необхідні, щоб зупинити цю агресію. Ми впевнені, що завдяки нашим зусиллям ми все ж таки будемо почуті. За час з 26 травня 2014 року і тим більше з 24 лютого цього року і по сьогодні було безліч можливостей у тих, хто дійсно має для цього силу, щоб поставити крапку і сказати «тепер Росія справді відчує повну ціну за те, що вона робить проти України, проти європейської єдності і проти свободи як такої». Теперішній наступ окупантів на Донбасі може зробити цей регіон безлюдним. Попасну, Бахмут, Лиман, Lysychansk, Severodonetsk вони хочуть перетворити просто на згарище, як Волноваху, як Маріуполь, в містах і громадах ближче до кордону Росії, в Донецьку, в Луганську вони збирають усіх, кого можуть, щоб заповнити місце убитих та поранених в окупаційному континенті. Усе це, включно з депортацією наших людей і масовими вбивствами цивільних, очевидна політика геноциду, яку здійснює Росія. Сьогодні знову окупантами був обстріляний Харків. На цей час в переліку загиблих 9 людей, 19 поранених. Усі мирні мешканці, вбиті, дитина, 5 місяців і батько. Мати в тяжкому стані. Серед поранених в Харкові також дівчинка 9 років. Знову ракетні удари, Сумщина, знову таки Донбас, знову значна активізація артилерії окупантів в Запорізькій області, знову їхні намагання вгризатися в землю на півдні країни. Тиск на Росію – це буквально питання збереження життів. І кожен день зволікання, слабкості, різних суперечок чи пропозицій умиротворити агресора за рахунок жертви – це нові вбиті українці. І це нові загрози для всіх на нашому континенті. Звернувся сьогодні до парламенту і народу Латвії. Подякував за допомогу, яку Україна отримала, зокрема оборону. І за ту допомогу, яку латвійська держава і латвійський народ надають зараз. Якби у всіх у світі була така ж рішучість в захисті нашої спільної свободи, як у Латвії та інших партнерів, які не вагаються, то просто не було би усього того зла, яке російська держава наробила в Україні, в Європі, у світі. Говорив сьогодні з прем'єр-міністром Нідерландів Марком Рютте. Проінформував про ситуацію на полі бою, про посилення активності окупантів. Обговорили, як можна адекватно посилити спроможність України оборонятися і відбивати ці атаки. Підписав новий указ про нагородження наших героїв. 180 військовослужбовців Збройних сил України відзначені державними нагородами, з них 28 посмертно. Загальна кількість нагороджених станом на цей день вже більше 16 тисяч. Якщо точно, 16 тисяч 44 за 92 дні. Але зрозуміло, що подвигів і звитяг наших оборонців в сотні й сотні разів більше. Я вдячний усім, хто тримає оборону, хто допомагає армії і всім нашим захисникам і захисницям. І наостанок, зазвичай цими днями у травні ми відзначаємо останній дзвоник у школах і вітаємо хлопців і дівчат із початком нового етапу в житті. Відверто кажучи, світлішого етапу, ніж дитинство, бо нарешті в житті з'являються можливості, дорослі можливості, але при цьому дитинство ще остаточно не закінчується. Цьогоріч в Україні немає цієї нашої традиційної шкільної святковості. І це зрозуміло, такий час, така ситуація. Та й не у всіх школах України навчання у цьому році завершується саме у травні. Та й не всі випускники зараз на території нашої держави. Але що незмінно? Яким би не був час і якою б не була ситуація, треба не втрачати свої можливості. Треба боротися, треба розвиватися, треба захищати свою свободу і вміти користуватися цією свободою. А отже, треба бути освіченими і сміливими, не втрачати жодного дня у житті, знати, для чого проживаєш день і обов'язково обов'язково вірити в Україну, бо тільки тут для українців і українок найбільше шансів для успіху, а особливо після нашої перемоги, яку ми обов'язково здобудемо і обов'язково приберемо словосполучення «тимчасово окуповані» щодо нашої землі, яка стане назавжди звільненою, як би не було складно. Вічна слава усім, хто став на захист України, вічна пам'ять кожному і кожній, чиє життя забрали окупанти. Слава Україні!
And with that, that is the end of the speech from President Zelensky here on day 92 of the war. We are only 8 days away from the 100th day of this war, and the Ukrainians are still holding on and have managed to make several major victories over the Russians over these past 3 months. And while the situation does look a little tense right now, with the Russians gaining the upper hand in a few areas in Luhansk, this is one of the few times that we've actually seen the Russians gain hand, and I believe and feel that it most likely will not last too long. And so with that, we have now reached the end of today's news. I thank you all once again so much for watching. Of course, it's been a pleasure to report the news to everyone, and of course, continue to report on the war in Ukraine and what is going on over there. So with that, if you are new to this channel and you just started watching, I hope you did enjoy, and if you did, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, because we do run these streams every single night of the week at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, and but except for Mondays, we do take that day off, and we also upload daily summaries covering what has been happening in the war in Ukraine. So with that, I thank you all once again for watching, and we're now going to move into the news segment, where we'll answer everyone's super chats, and we'll also answer questions from the live chat. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
All right, so first up from the super chats, we have a $20 donation from Ole Wolansky, who says, "This is for all the support from people in the channel, and of course, espresso money for all the people that are hanging in there, even in the worst times."
Well, I thank you very much for the support, Ola. I'm not really sure if that's the first time you've sent in a super chat or not, but if it is, I thank you so much for the support, because it does help out this channel a lot. And of course, we operate entirely off of the graciousness of our viewers, and so if we manage to not make any income off of super chats, which, you know, of course is a possibility because we don't run any ads or anything, so there's no other kind of revenue coming off of this channel. So of course the support is always what is, oh sorry, I've just completely fell that sentence apart. The support from super chats is the only way we can run this channel, and so support like that does manage to help keep this channel running. So thank you so much for enjoying everything we do here on this channel, and of course the support helps us to keep on doing what we're doing here. And so with that, thank you once again, and we're going to move on to the next question.
All right, and next up from the super chats, we have a $10 donation from William Arens, who says, "Is this war changed from being a World War II style war of movement into a World War I kind of conflict with long static lines and entrenched armies? This is what existed on the front lines already in Donetsk and Luhansk."
Well, I thank you very much for the support, and that's actually an incredibly good question. I believe that's still a mobile war, much like World War II. Because in World War II, the front lines always weren't moving 5 to 10 miles a day. Sometimes, for example, right outside of Moscow, the front line remained stable for months on end. Also, the same could be said about Stalingrad and also Leningrad, which is now called St. Petersburg, here in the north. So while it could be said that it's turning into a World War I style war, there is still, of course, a decent amount of movement that does occur on the single day. For example, the Russians managed to conduct this 6-mile breakthrough from Torskay to Lyman over the course of one day, and that is World War II level speeds of movement. So while the front lines have largely stabilized, I still feel that it's mostly a mobile war revolving around speed and maneuverability. It's just that the Russians have been so ground down over the course of this war that they're not really able to conduct the movement that they did at the start, moving everything across the front lines at a single time. So I thank you very much for the support, and I hope that does answer the question. And with that, we're on to the next one.
And next up, we have a $10 donation from Jungle Jim AB9AB, who says, "Enforcer, are the Russian T-62M second-line tanks recently reported en route to the Ukrainian war, possibly for use by the proxy separatist forces and not actually for frontline Russian troops?"
I would doubt that, because the thing is that the Donetsk and Luhansk republics have pretty small populations, and so the amount of T-62s they're bringing in, it would be highly unlikely that they would actually be giving those to DPR and LPR soldiers, and also that requires a level of training to operate a tank of any sort, and I feel like the DPR and LPR doesn't really have the ability to train a large amount of tankers like that over such a short amount of time. Of course, that could be the case. I'm not saying that that's not the case at all. It's just that I don't think that would be the case given the circumstances. But of course, the Russians really never make any sense with what they do, and so that may be the actual fact of what's happening. But one thing that I've been thinking is, since we've seen these arrive in Melitopol instead of in the DPR and LPR, which if they were to be given to them, it would make a lot more sense for them to arrive there. It appears that they may be offloading those tanks to the southern front and trying to replenish some of their tank losses there with these T-62Ms. At least that's what I'm thinking. Of course, I could be wrong, but it does seem that everything's kind of lining up where those are actually replacement tanks for the Russian losses that they've taken in that area. So I thank you very much for the support, and I hope that does answer the question. And with that being said, we're on to the next one.
And next up, we have another super chat from Paolo Corradini, who puts in a $10 donation and says, "It's very interesting for us Italians to see some of what our government gave Ukraine, because Italy is, as far as I know, the only country on earth that made the list of provided weapons a state secret."
Well, that's very interesting. I actually didn't know that the Italians were keeping that a state secret. And of course, the Italians actually have a very interesting military history. And I'd say one of the shining moments of the Italians over the past, I guess you could say, over 100 years of war would be Isonzo, the Battle of Isonzo that occurred here in eastern Italy against the Austrian-Hungarians. Of course, that was really interesting stuff back then, of course, historically. And also, there's a video game called Isonzo coming out in the future. Not to get sidetracked off of the war or anything, but it's really cool, and I'm a huge fan of the Verdun series of games. Moving back onto the war, though, it's, of course, interesting to hear that, and then know that we now have pictures and proof that the Italians have provided artillery systems like the FH-70 to the Ukrainians, which will hopefully be put to great use. So I thank you very much for the support, Paolo, and that's actually an interesting little tidbit of information to hear that I didn't know before. And so with that, thank you once again, and we're going to move on to the next question.
And moving on, we have an $8 donation from Monsieur Lunchtime, who says, "If you have Speak the Truth on, you need to play his game wherein you down a shot, or in my case, a burger, for every Ukrainian name he butchers. Examples include Severodonetsk, Rybizine, and Popsana."
Well, thank you very much for the support, Mr. Lunchtime. Of course, it's always good to have you around, and the support does help us to run the channel. And I can't ever say that enough, because we are more than appreciative for everyone's support. That's the only way we run the channel. But to answer that question, we're thinking about bringing Speak the Truth on. Of course, it's kind of a little bit of a question if we bring guest speakers on, because there's always a lot of people who want to come on, but at the same time, I always want to make sure that we are, of course, bringing new stuff through the channel and not just doing the same thing over and over. Of course, Operator Starsky is always welcome, but I want to make sure that we can rotate out our guests so that way it doesn't become too repetitive and it's always interesting on a Sunday fundraiser night. So if we do bring him on, I'll make sure to take a shot if he does do something like that. Of course, I can't really joke too much because I mispronounce all kinds of stuff. It just kind of comes with the territory of covering news and information of a country that does speak a foreign language. But and also, that same thing can be said about Britain. Although it's English speaking, there's a whole bunch of towns in Britain that you would not think are pronounced the way they are. Like, for example, if we come up to Newcastle, there is a small town up here. Actually, I think it's further. No, it's not. Alnwick. This looks like Alnwick, but it's actually Alnwick, and it's very, very weird and confusing. And that's because of English history. It's very interesting history, but still, I can't really get on to anyone too much because I mispronounce a million things. But I do thank you very much for the support, and I hope that does address the comment. And with that being said, we're on to the next question.
And next up, we have a super chat from Applied Cryogenics, who puts in a $5 donation and says, "Enforcer, are there enough skilled people in Ukraine to handle all these relief supplies and weapons? Any there calls for Oh, excuse me. Are there calls for more foreign volunteers? Excuse me.
There haven't been any more calls for foreign volunteers as I know. They pretty much fielded the largest number of foreign legion units that they possibly can supply and actually field reasonably. And so there hasn't been a call for more foreign volunteers. And sadly, the Ukrainians keep their logistics and their operations of supplies a state secret nearly, and no one has an idea of how that stuff is actually conducted and how well off it is. So sadly, I really can't make a testament to how well the Ukrainian logistics are operating and how much and how often they're getting Western supplies from the western side of the country to the eastern side where the fight is currently ongoing. So I thank you very much for the support, and I hope that does answer the question, but sadly, there's just not enough information to go off of to even make an assumption in that category. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And next up, let me recognize a $5 donation from Jim Darby. Thank you very much, Jim, for your very nice donation there. And he does not leave a comment, so we will be moving on to the next super chat, which we have from B. Dobson, who puts in a $5 super chat and says, Good juju, mate. Y'all keep kicking. Was here since the stream before Moscow Mike. Almost bailed. Enough said.
Well, thank you very much for the support. And Moscow Mike was a very dark time during this channel's history. We actually, he was a neighbor. We brought him on because I thought, maybe he'll be able to give interesting input. And it was also the easiest guest speaker for me to find. And I was just trying to see how guest speakers would work out then. So I wasn't really wanting to, like, do a whole lot of work for it and then figure out that it went terribly anyways. And so we brought him on, and then we immediately regretted it after we heard what he said. So it's always interesting and great to hear that we have long-time viewers here on this channel who have been enjoying this stuff and watching it for an incredibly long time and are still here and watching it. Of course, I'm very happy to hear that as always. And it's always wonderful to hear that you've been around for a very, very long time, because that was months ago at this point. So I thank you very much for the support, and I hope that does address the comment. And I am very grateful and appreciative and very honored that a lot of people watch this stream when they could be doing other things. And so with that, thank you once again, and we're going to move on to the next question.
And up next, we have a $10 super chat from David McCallman, who says, Do you say pronunciation like that on purpose? I love the channel and all the work you do.
Well, thank you very much for the support. Of course, it's always wonderful to hear that you do enjoy the channel. But surprisingly, I actually say pronunciation like that because that's just how Southern people pronounce it. Like, literally. You can ask Matthew. Like, Matthew, don't you say pronunciation?
Yes.
Now, I do know, and this is something that I know a lot, is that just because it's the Southern way of pronouncing it doesn't mean it's the correct way of pronouncing it. The correct way of saying pronounce is pronunciation. But still, at the same time, I grew up saying it that way. That's just kind of like the Southern dialect, I guess you could say, and how it turned out. That's kind of like how British people say aluminium and jaguar, and Americans say jaguar and aluminum, if you see what I'm saying. But I thank you very much for the support. And no, I'm not unironically saying pronunciation. That's just how it's pronounced down here. And so I thank you very much for the support, and I hope that does answer the question. And with that, we're on to the next one.
And up next, we have a $5 donation from Rob Scott, who says, Never forget, when a soldier hits that button, they just killed X amount of people. That's nothing to be excited about. I'm a Canadian veteran.
Could you reread that one more time for me?
He said, Never forget, when a soldier hits the button, they just killed X amount of people, and that's nothing to be excited about. I'm a Canadian veteran.
Well, thank you very much for being in the Armed Services of Canada, although I'm not a Canadian, of course, that's a great thing. But one thing that does have to be noted is that while it's, of course, not really great to cheer on the demise of other people, the Russians are invaders. And so while I'm not really cheering on the carnage in a way of, you know, these people being killed, it's more so cheering on the success of the Ukrainian armed forces and their defense of the country, if you see what I'm saying. So while it may be construed that I'm saying it in one way, it's actually really more so meant in another. Because every single Russian vehicle destroyed and infantry that are knocked out is more Russian units and troops that aren't going to be pushing into the Ukrainian defenses, killing Ukrainian citizens, soldiers, and children, and pushing through the country like a steamroller and killing nearly everything in its path. So I hope you understand where I'm coming from. Of course, I understand your sentiments, but at the same time, I try to keep a neutral stance like that at the beginning of the war. I don't know if you were around during like the first week or two of these streams, but I actually would talk like that at the beginning. But then we would see the Russians killing civilians over and over and over, and it started to get worse and worse. And then it became a run-of-the-mill daily thing to hear about how many civilians they were killing per day. And so it started to become less of a clinical thing to see Russian vehicles and equipment and troops being destroyed, and it became more of a celebratory thing, knowing that those soldiers and their vehicles would never go on to kill any more civilians because they've been stopped dead in their tracks. And so I hope that kind of explains my standing a little bit better on that. And so I thank you very much for the support, and with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And up next, we have a $20 super chat from Joseph Neves. He says it's Neves, not Neves, and thank you guys for keeping up the good work and being consistent. Puck Putin, Slava Ukraine.
You actually got me there at the end, Joseph, but I thank you very much for the support. And also, it's a good thing that we were able to correct. What was that? We were able to correct the pronunciation of your name. Of course, that's something that's always hard for us to do. We hardly pronounce anything right, but of course, we always try our best. So thank you once again for the support, Joseph Neves. It does help us out a lot and helps us to continue running this channel. And without support from our viewers, the channel just can't go on. So thank you once again. And with that, we're moving on to the next question.
And next up, we have a $5 donation from Scott2412S, who says, how is Russia getting all of their supplies? I thought they were low on trucks.
They are low on trucks, but one thing that they have done is that they've greatly lessened the logistical burden of supporting all of their forces. Instead of having them over 7 logistical hubs surrounding the entirety of the border of Ukraine, they've now most likely lowered those amounts of logistical hubs to around 3 or 4. And now those trucks have to all start off from one base and supply all of these units in a much smaller area. So that, of course, has been lessening the burden on their logistical forces a great deal. Another thing that they've been trying to do to lessen the gap, although they've never really fixed it all the way, and that's why we're seeing a large amount of static fronts, for example, near Kharkiv and also near the Balaklia and the entire southern front area, is because while they've been trying to lessen the logistical strain, they've never really fixed it, and they've also been requisitioning a large amount of civilian vehicles to try and fill in those gaps as well. So I thank you very much for the support, and I hope that does answer the question pretty well. It's a great question, but there is proof to show that the Russians have very little logistical abilities now, because the only 2 areas of action that we've seen on the entire front lines over the past week or 2 has been entirely in the Lyman area and also the Popasna area. The rest of the front lines have practically fallen completely silent. And so I hope that answers the question, and I thank you once again for the support. And with that being said, we're moving on to the next question.
And next up, we have a $5 super chat from Rated PG, who says, Enforcer, what might the Russians be doing differently to take the offensive that they weren't doing before?
Well, we do know from Starsky that they have been using a new strategy, and I actually explained this on last night's stream, but it is fairly new, and so I'm going to make sure to answer it again because it's a very threatening strategy to Ukraine's defense. The Russians will push forward a mechanized brigade, which will attack the Ukrainian infantry head-on. And so the Ukrainian mechanized, or whatever kind of unit that the Ukrainians are using, will be fighting a mechanized unit head-on. The Russians will then use an airborne unit to then bypass the Ukrainians, push through a weak spot, kind of like how a German blitzkrieg would actually be conducted, and then break through the Ukrainian lines and towards their rear, which then threatens the Ukrainians with encirclement. And so then the Ukrainians will get up out of their defensive positions and withdraw to a new defensive location, which is how the Russians have been gaining this land so far. So that's kind of the new strategy that's been leading to these 2 breakthroughs, and hopefully the Ukrainians can find a good counter to that strategy, because it does appear that that's giving the Russians renewed success when they had never been met with it before during the entirety of this war. And so I thank you very much for the support, and I hope that does answer the question. And with that being said, we're on to the next one.
And up next, we have a $5 super chat from DD Reynolds, who says, what Russian soldiers need is some bud. They'll be so focused on finding more Scooby snacks that Ukraine soldiers can liberate them very swiftly. Slava Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much for the support, and of course, I know that this was a huge thing back in the day, but I actually do not smoke the hashish, the hash, the devil's lettuce. I don't do that stuff, but if you do, I don't judge. You know, that's your business, not mine. But still, I do think that that would be a pretty viable strategy for the Ukrainians. It's just a question of how do we get that Kush over to the Russians. So I thank you very much for the support. I hope that does answer the comment in a way, and I do like the joke. It's a pretty good one. And so with that being said, we're on to the next question.
And up next, we have a $5 super chat from Diffuse56, who says, any news at all about the fate of the last little group of commanders and co. that stayed inside the Mariupol steel plant?
Sadly, we haven't gotten a lot of news on them lately. I'm not really sure what the state of those units are. But we do know from Operator Starsky that there are still units holding out in there, but I haven't heard of any firefights, seen any footage of it, and I also haven't been seeing any more reports from the Azov unit that's still left. So I'm not really sure exactly what's happening in there anymore. In fact, based off of the total silence that's coming from the Azovstal steel plant, it may be reasonable to assume that there are no units left there and that they have surrendered, although I highly doubt that because the Azov was a very hardened group of defenders that fought incredibly well to make sure that the Azovstal would hold, and I believe that they're still dedicated to that objective in a way, although we haven't heard a lot of news about it. So I thank you very much for the support, and I hope that answers the question, and with that being said, we're on to the next one.
And next up, we have a $5 donation from Kaltenberg, who says, aluminum versus aluminium, spelled different. Thanks, Enforcer.
Well, I thank you very much for the support, and that is true. The British actually do spell aluminum different. They spell it aluminium. But still, it does show that there are variances and differences between dialects of English. For example, English, and then American English. That's also why sometimes when people say they speak American, I can kind of get where they're coming from, because British English is different enough that I guess you could call it American, although that's still a stretch. Because there is, for example, Spanish, and then there's Latin Spanish, which is, of course, what the South American countries largely use. Like, for example, the Spanish say jeans, which is jeans, but the South Americans say vaqueros, which also means jeans, but because of their dialect, I guess you could call it the Latin Spanish dialect, they say it a different way. So it's kind of a little bit interesting delve into linguistics, but that's always interesting to me. So I thank you very much for the support and also providing that little informational tidbit. I forgot to note that, but still, it is a difference in pronunciation and also spelling in that way. And so with that, we're on to the next question.
And to round out our Super Chat segment tonight, we have 3 Super Chats without comments. So we have a $10 Super Chat from Sharon Tikolsky, a $2 Super Chat from Vlad Lozo 1111, and a $4 Super Chat from Junebug. Thank you very much to all of you for your support, and thank you to everyone else who put in a Super Chat tonight. We appreciate it very much, and as the Enforcer and me constantly say, it helps us run the channel, and we thank you all so very much for your generosity. So, Enforcer, when you're ready, I do have some live chat questions ready.
All right, and with that, let's get to them.
Okay, and first up, we have a question from Sherry Wellsford, who says, Enforcer, I thought that if Russia uses chemicals, such as white phosphorus, then the U.S. would consider that a tipping point and get more involved with the war. Have you heard that?
No, actually, it was chemical, biological, or nuclear, and white phosphorus does not fall under chemical, biological, or nuclear. It falls under the incendiary category, which isn't really chemical, per se. Chemical or biological is kind of like a, I guess you could call them poison gases, and sadly, phosphorus doesn't fall under that category, which would lead us into Ukraine. We did hear at a time, there was a rumor that the Russians had used poison gas on the soldiers in Mariupol. Well, that turned out to actually be untrue, as the Ukrainians came out and said that that was not true. So, I hope that kind of answers the question in a way. It will require a chemical, biological, or a nuclear attack for the West to get involved. At least the United States, which will most likely drag the rest of NATO in. So, I hope that answers the question, and with that, we're on to the next one.
All right, and next up, before we move on to our next live chat question, I think one of the viewers have figured out the Morse code, although possibly. It's from Mike D, and he says the Morse code is Z ready 3 days.
It's actually B ready, with a B, But yes, that was actually put up 2 days ago, and so today is that last day of the 3rd day countdown. And so a lot of y'all are probably wondering, what am I talking about? What's up our sleeves, and what are we going to be doing next? And the answer to that is that y'all are going to have to find out, because that is the whole reason for it. So with that, you did get it correct. It does say that, and the big reveal will be tomorrow. So with that, thank you all so much for noting that and also trying to decipher the Morse code message as well. That's actually really cool that we do have people down there that can do that. And with that, we're on to the next question.
And up next, we have one from Tony Wastara, who says, is Turkey really blocking Finland and Sweden?
Yes, they are. We believe they're blocking them for some kind of leverage within NATO to get some kind of benefits or support. But right now, it seems that that hurdle may be getting... well, everyone may be getting over that hurdle, because it seems that the Sweden NATO situation is still developing, and that Finland and Sweden are most likely going to be joining NATO very soon. So I hope that does answer the question, and with that, we're moving on to the next one.
And next up, we have a question from Ninja Behind the Scene, who says, Enforcer, would you agree that this is probably one of the most diverse group of weapons, both technologically and culturally, ever deployed against one aggressor in history?
I would have to definitely agree. That's kind of a tough one to answer. Because if we were talking about weapons-wise, I think you could say that the Afghans, the Taliban, and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan probably had the most diverse weapon set, because they had any weapon you could imagine. And while we always talk about AKs and Dragunovs and stuff like that, because those are common, of course, among those fighters, they also were using things like Martini Henrys, Lee Enfields, Sten guns, captured American weapons if they were able to ever get those, which was incredibly rare. And I mean, that was a very varied weapon set that the Taliban and Mujahideen were using. And also the Iraqi resistance as well. For example, ISIS, they had a wide variety of antique weapons they would use too. But in the modern sense, in an actual conventional ground war, I would have to say that the variety of weapons they are fielding has been vast and very varied, very diverse to say the least. To also go into the, I guess you could say, diversity of the fighting force. Surprisingly, now this is a crazy one. This is something that you don't really consider, but historically, the SS unit of Nazi Germany was the most ethnically diverse military unit in all of history. They pulled people from around the world, which is bizarre to me because there were Jews in the SS, and the SS literally sought out and killed Jews along with the Einsatzgruppen, which is really weird to think about, that they actually had Jews amongst their ranks and they knew it. They also pulled a few Americans. They had a plan for a George Washington Legion, but so few Americans joined that it didn't actually turn into a legion. They also had the same thing for the British, but literally 2 British joined the SS once they got captured as prisoners of war, so that didn't really come to fruition. But they had a large amount of Poles, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Austrians, Czechs, Slovaks, Indians even. They had a large amount of people who joined the SS. So surprisingly enough, the most racist regime in world history had one of the, the most diverse unit in terms of the kind of people that were in the SS in world history. So sadly, the Ukrainians don't get the credit for that one. It's surprisingly the Nazis, which is really bizarre when you say that out loud, that the Aryan racist people in their heads had the most diverse unit in history. And so with that, I hope that answers the question, and we're going to move on to the next one.
And next up, we have a question from Cromwell, who says, is it true that intel reporting about China getting ready for invasion late this year, and that Taiwan is only a decoy because their target is the United States?
Okay, that's entirely fake. I don't know who's spreading that one, but that's not possible. China could not logistically support an invasion across nearly 8,000 miles of ocean to California and then keep up a steady supply line to make sure that an invasion like that could keep on going. On top of that, China's military is subpar compared to the United States, and the American Navy is much larger in comparison to the Chinese. We would see that coming months before it ever made the United States, and if that was something that we were fearful of, we could of course just destroy them at sea, because we have more aircraft carriers than the rest of the world combined. So that's not true at all. They would never attack the United States, and also that put them in a bad situation economically, which would make their economy shrink faster than George Costanza did when he went to the pool. So I hope that answers the question, and with that, we're on to the next one.
And next up, we have a question from Bugaboo, who says, are the Russians using depleted uranium munitions?
I don't think so. I'm not really sure about that. Of course, I'm not an expert on everything, and so sadly, I really can't make a testament to whether they are or not. But I do thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to declare ignorance on that one, though. And with that, we're on to the next question.
And next up, we have a question from Pakatang, who says, Enforcer, what are some of the most strategic targets within Russia for saboteurs to strike to cripple the Russian invasion effort?
The most critical targets to strike are bridges, railroads, railroad bridges, and also rail yards. You can also go down into people as well. Of course, politicians are always important to target. You can also target people who are involved in logistics, for example, train engineers, conductors, and the like. You could always go there. And you could also just reach out and attack the people who make it all work, which are the people who operate the timetable that these trains run on. If you kill the guy who operates the timetable, the Russians aren't going to have experienced people in large numbers that actually know the layout of the railroad and how long it takes for trains to reach one end to the other. So, of course, that could affect the long-term efficiency of Russian railroads if you were to start killing off the people who create the timetables. Of course, you could go further down the chain and get the engineers as well. So I hope that kind of answers the question in brief, because there's a decent amount of attacks that you can do on Russian supplies and logistics to really break it apart, and I think those will be the best answers to it. So I thank you very much for the question. I hope that does answer it, and with that being said, we're on to the next one.
And next up, we have a question from Ralph Araria, who says, why isn't Ukraine attacking Russian land when and where they can? It seems like Ukraine is playing a defense game, always in their half of the field.
That is true. They are playing a defensive game. This is a defensive war, after all, and attacking the Russians too much on their side of the border may lead to a very strong response from the Russians, where they have to mobilize their forces and try and make sure that the Ukrainians cannot attack Russians within their country, because if they start to do that to a large degree, it's going to make the Russians look like they're losing, and that's something they really couldn't hide around for too long and even save face with. So one does have to remember always that the Ukrainians are fighting a defensive war here, and so they really don't want to do much to push this out of their country, because then the Russians could try and frame them as the attacker and the Nazis that they're trying to paint them to be. So I hope that answers the question, and with that, we're on to the next one.
And up next, we have a question from Practical Ken, who says, is it possible to bribe the Russian armored vehicles by offering amnesty if they bring their tanks in under white flag and paid them for the armored vehicles? Most soldiers are poor.
I think that may work, although we haven't seen anything like that before, where a Russian vehicle is able to break away from its unit and surrender. I think it would be a lot more effective, honestly, and a lot cheaper for the Ukrainians to just fire one artillery round near a tank and then let the crew bail out, because that's almost inevitable. So I thank you for the question. I hope that does answer it, at least in brief. And with that, we're going to answer about 3 more questions from the live chat, and then we're going to end the stream for the night. And so with that, we're on to the next question.
And next up, we have a question from Nicholas Rodriguez, who says, do the Russians have enough men and equipment left to open up another front in a new country?
No, I don't really think so, because while they do have large amounts of conscripts, the conscripts are worse off than the contract soldiers that they have within Ukraine right now. And of course, there are a few conscripts in Ukraine. We know that there was around 20 to 30,000 initially, but I think that most of those have been injured or killed, and so now they've been replaced most likely by contract soldiers as well, or more conscripts. To move on up to the north, though, the Russians would have to pull entirely on conscripts to attack a country like Finland, and of course that would put Finland in the immediate advantage right when the war started off, because they would have trained contract soldiers going up against poorly trained and poorly equipped conscripts, so it would nearly be like knights fighting peasants. It would be an entirely lopsided battle, and it would be in Finland's favor in every aspect but the numbers. So I hope that answers the question, and with that, we're going to move on to the next one.
And next up, we have a question from Giovanni, who says, Enforcer, I hear Ukraine is getting long-range American MLRS and HIMARS. Did you hear this as well?
I did hear that. That was something that we heard about a week ago, and unfortunately, I haven't heard any more news about it yet, and I haven't seen those hit the front lines, but we are still waiting for that, and if we do get any news on it, we will make sure to say it here on the channel, because I'm looking forward to seeing if the Ukrainians will actually be able to field some of those. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the last question of tonight's stream. And so, what do we got as our last question, Matthew?
So the last question goes to Super Action General, who says, Enforcer, I heard some of the M777s have been knocked out. Is this true?
We did see a video of a Russian suicide drone landing in the middle of M777s, but we didn't actually see any confirmation that they were actually destroyed. So, with that in mind, I'm not really sure. We haven't seen anything on film to clearly confirm that an M777 has been entirely destroyed. We've seen where they may have been lightly damaged, but we've never gotten any proof to go the other direction and say that it has been destroyed. And so I hope that answers the question. And with that, we have reached the end of tonight's stream. I thank you all so much for watching. If you are new to this channel and you did enjoy the stream, make sure to subscribe because it does help out this channel a lot. And we do run streams every single night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, except for Mondays, covering the past 24 hours of the war in Ukraine. And we also upload daily summaries as well. And so with that, I thank you all so much once again for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow at 10 p.m. Eastern Time to cover day 93 of the news of the war in Ukraine. Thank you all once again, and I'll see you all in the next one. Good luck. Well, actually, sorry, good night, and take care. See you all around.
Not